Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. It is indeed my honor to give this lecture, all in honor of my father-in-law, Professor Shih-I. In here, I'm selecting this topic of looking at the two countries, the United States and China. They're two countries about the same size, on the opposite of the globe. They're different in history and in culture, and somehow there's affinity between the two peoples. When we're in good relationship, everyone's happy. When the two countries are in conflict, someone will suffer. When we're at war, for example, during the Korean War, about 300 people of Chinese American died, and twice the amount of Korean died of the war. So my message is very clear, that we need to maintain good relationship. What I would like to illustrate in this lecture is that the US training of the Chinese scientists are beneficial to both countries, and this would improve the relationship between the two countries. Before I share with you the story of Professor Shih-I and his contemporary who came to the United States to study in the 1930s, 1940s, I want to give you a brief review of modern Chinese history and talk about the impact of a group of scientists who came to the United States to study in 1910. And then I talk about US-China interactions in biomedical sciences after normalization in the 1970s. In the 18th century, the agrarian Chinese society and the Manchu government is no match to invading Western power. There are a series of defeats, for example, in the Opium Wars, and some of the officers realized that the Chinese need to learn about industrial and military technology. So they sent the first group of small children, they're made in their twins, my grandson's age, to the United States in 1872. But this type of training would not help the country immediately. After constant humiliation from the invasion, some of the Manchu officers turned to the boxers. The leaders of boxers of the disfranchised element of the society, military deserters, gangsters, they recruited patients to practice martial law in the name of self-defense. And somehow they really get into fanatic about it. And they believe they had the power to resist the attack of guns. And some of the government officers use them to attack foreigners, missionaries, diplomats, merchants. They burn churches and killing people. And this is the Boxer known as the Boxer Rebellion. 8 countries invaded China and easily captured Beijing. This is US infantry and cavalry in Beijing. China has to pay an endowment fund of 335 million in silver. At that time, it was a lot of money. It's twice the income of the government income in China. Later it was found the US claim of 25 million was exaggerated. At that time, the United States, under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, is a rising power. So they want to exert their influence and show goodwill. So they want to use the money as scholarship for the Chinese student to be trained in science and technology. So this is the famous Boxer Indemnity Scholarship, or also known as the Boxer Scholarship. So starting in 1909, they trained hundreds of students, which made major impact in China and in the United States. Now, this is a picture of a group of high school students selected by very competitive examination. They were trained at Tsinghua University for 2 years, learned basic Chinese classics, mathematics, and English. And then in 1910, they were sent to the United States for study. Now, in this group of students, there are quite a few famous ones. I'll tell you the story about Hu Shi and Zhu Kezhen later. And Zhao Yuanren here is a philosopher, is a talented linguist and a famous musician. where Hu Mingfu is a gifted mathematician, Bing Zhe is a renowned biologist, and Zhou Ren is an engineer. So when this group of students arrived in China, they breathed the fresh air of the new country. They were impressed, really enjoyed by the academic atmosphere in the campuses, the freedom of thinking and learning, and they were impressed by this vitality of this new country. They started to ask themselves, can we make China like this? So they start formed the Science Society in 1914. By that time, there's already the Republic of China established. The Manchu government was destroyed, and the new government that gave them encouragement, really trying to do something after they go back to China to rebuild China. So the purpose is to promote scientific thinking, scientific method, and culture change and civil society. So that's their purpose. They also found the journal 科学, that means science, used in Western styles, punctuation, and sort of horizontal type of, this is the first among Chinese magazines or journals. Now, Hu Shi is the most famous one. He came to Cornell to study agriculture, but he found philosophy is more interesting. He went to Columbia to study under John Dewey to learn about programmatic experimentalism. And after graduation, he went back to Beijing University. At that time, China is not strong, but this is an exciting time for a young professor to use what he has learned in the United States to improve China. He was admired by students for his knowledge and for his mannerism. The next year, there's a breakthrough of the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement started as a patriotic student demonstration against the unfair treatment of China by the Western power after World War I. And soon it became a bigger, larger culture movement. This is also known as the Chinese Renaissance. They called for using democracy and science to save China. And Hu Shi became a leader of that, and especially in the promotion of vernacular Chinese language, basically to write in day-to-day language rather than imitating the classics writing. So this really popularized the literature and everything. So he also promoted the programmatic evolution changes rather than revolution. He also said he prefers study problems rather than talking about isms. At that time in China, it's very fashionable to talk about communism and other isms, and people start to debate and end up debate for nothing without really touching the real problems. During the war in 1938 with Japan, and Hu Shi was sent to the United States to become the Chinese ambassador to help the relationships between two countries in the resistance of the Japanese. In 1945, the Japanese surrendered. This is probably the happiest time of Hu Shi, and practically the happiest time of all Chinese. He was named the president of Beijing University and very highly respected. He tried, as a university president, he tried to keep politics away from the politics out of the campus. But during the brutal war, his rational ideas and advice was ignored. In 1949, the communists took over, and Hu Shi came to the United States. In 1947, he went back to Taiwan to become the president of the Academic Seneca in Taipei. But still, he cannot avoid politics. Well, he's believed in democracy, but there's always dictatorship in the government. He was a respected guest, but not welcomed by President Chiang Kai-shek. Now, Zhu Kezheng also came in 1910 to the University of Illinois to study agriculture. But he found that agriculture in China and the United States is very different. He said maybe something even more important, meteorology. So he went to Harvard to study that and study the Chinese rainfall, the typhoons, and he is also active in the science society, as I mentioned here. He taught in many different universities and was the Department of Geoscience and trained many meteorologists and geographers in China and wrote books. He was the director of the Institute of Meteorology of Academic Seneca. He helped to establish a network of weather stations and predict Chinese weather patterns. Before that, Chinese had to listen to the foreigners to tell them whether it be rain or shine the next day. Well, he's noted in China, and he was the president of Zhejiang University. And this is the beautiful campus of Zhejiang University, where he served as president for a long time, where he studied science history. So he pointed out in the Chinese, historically, the Chinese have been overtly unitarian. That suppressed curiosity-driven pursuit of science. I believe today is still true. And in 1949, there's a tragic change of government, and he also studied Chinese climate fluctuations and made major contributions in that particular area. As we talk about his strong belief in the scientific method and the civil society, so in 1949, he had high hope for the new government led by Mao Zedong working toward the reconstruction of China. But he began to worry after he heard a lecture from a Communist Party stating that Marxism and Leninism are the highest principle of all theories in the world. And he started worrying. Indeed, their Chinese scientists and science has been interfered or basically sometimes tortured by one political movement after another. During the Cultural Revolution, started in 1966, he really suffered. His son committed suicide. Many scientists, especially Western scientists, were tortured. Some of them committed suicide. What a tragedy. Now, a famous biochemist, Wu Xian, was trained at Harvard and MIT. He developed the first assay for blood sugar. This is the famous Wu and folding Wu assay. Folding is his mentor at Harvard. And after that, he returned to Beijing Union Medical College, become professor, and then the head. So he's the first one to propose that protein denaturation was a pure conformational change. So this concept was picked up by Linus Pauling and others to lead the development understanding of the secondary and tertiary structure of proteins. His son, Ray Wu, was a professor at Cornell, and he is regarded as one of the founding fathers of plant genetic engineering. So he consulted both in China and Taiwan to help their science development. Also, he runs the CUSP program, which is for the Chinese students, outstanding Chinese students, to come to the United States for graduate training. So of this group students came many outstanding biologists, biochemistry, molecular biologists. Most of them stayed in the United States, and some returned to China. Now, the second part of the story is about Professor Shih-I and his contemporaries who came to the United States in the 1930s. And this is the period when Japan was under the barbaric invasion from, China was under barbaric invasion from China. And this is the time when Shih-I graduated from high school. I was told originally he planned to study literature in college. One of his students told him that you are so smart, you should study engineering, not literature. So he made a special effort to visit the Pai residence, to talk to the father of Shih-I, to convince the whole family to support Shih-I to study engineering. Therefore, he obtained a degree in electrical engineering in 1935. And being a top student, he was selected to enter the special mechanical engineering graduate class in the Central University. So this is a secret plan of the Chinese government to build their aviation industry, aircraft industry, and air defense system. Before that, China cannot make any planes. Basically, the Japanese dominate all the skies in China. So this is a plan they don't want the Japanese to know, so they are sort of a very smart group of students was selected, really treat them well. Also, they're allowed to stand, in meetings, they sit behind the female students, sort of really treated very well and very smart student. And afterwards, the government sent him to MIT to study aeronautic engineering. As you can see, many of the students selected to come to the United States at that time are very bright and well prepared. It takes 2 or 2.5 years for them to get a master's degree and a PhD. In 1939, get a PhD under Theodore Van Karman. Van Karman was a giant in the field and considered to be the father of the missile. And soon after that, he returned to China to teach. At that time, because the war, this university moved from Nanjing to Chongqing. And he also is a chief engineer of a glider factory. He taught many bright students. Some of them stayed in China. Some of them come to the United States. I'll mention a couple of them later. Now, in 1949, after working in China for 6 or 7 years, he took sabbatic at Cornell University. It's that time when the civil war in China broke into really very, it's become a tragedy, fighting, thousands of people getting killed. So at that time, he decided to stay in the United States. That was a very smart decision. In 1950, the family came to join him. In 1949, Dr. Martin invited Professor Pai to come to University of Maryland to start as a co-founder of the Institute of Fluid Dynamics and Applied Mathematics. At that time, the fluid dynamics is a very important topic for study because they developed the supersonic jet and all the things. There's a lot of activities. This one with the center of the activities. Many top scientists are at this institute or come to visit. And Professor Pai worked very studiously, very hard, really to learn everything, learn from others. He himself is very good at this, become a very expert, well-respected expert in this field. So his research on aerodynamics, he was able to elucidate the interactions, the interplays of electric, chemical, and electromagnetic forces in supersonic flight. And he taught and wrote books and doing consultation. He wrote 14 books, many of them translated into many different languages and well used worldwide. In 1983, he became professor emeritus. He was remembered as a bright scientist, a very kind person, very nice to his family members and to his friend, and a loving father and grandfather. So in this 30-some years at University of Maryland, he lived a very enjoyable life, a very productive life. And he really enjoyed traveling, take sabbatic leaves, and rejoined many things, music and museums and so on. And this is the retirement party, 83. Here's the family photo. This is many years ago. Many of them are growing up now. That just want to mention one person here. That's his second son, Robert. Dr. Robert Pai led the development of compact fluorescent light bulbs and make major contributions. This is an article from the New York Times. Playing with grandchildren or grandchildren. And this is the first Shih-I Pai lecture with the speaker, Bertram Y.C. Feng, professor from UCSD. Professor Feng is a pioneer in in medical engineering, medical engineering, and did studies on blood flow. Basically, he's a very accomplished investigator in the fluid dynamics area, and then he put in the biomedical sciences and made major contributions. Dr. York's in the center, and Professor Pai. And this is the Engineering Centennial Award with Dr. Tao. Now, let me come back to his contemporaries, some of his friends of this special aeronautic engineering class. I learned some of the stories from the writing of their friends and the stories. The top 3 students were selected to send abroad. Professor Li and Pai went to MIT, and Professor Huang went to England, and later to Stanford. So by 1939, 1940, all 3 went back to China, and Professor Li built the first aircraft engine factory in China. At that time, wasn't easy. Professor Pai and Professor Huang returned to alma mater at the National Central University, taught many outstanding students. They were known as the baby professors. At that time, Professor Pai was 26, and Professor Huang was even younger. But the students admired them for their knowledge. During this period when they're in China, they served China well. In 1949, because of political changes, Professor Li and Professor Pai came back to the United States. And since they built their career here, and they really contributed to the society, and Professor Huang stayed in China. Now, Professor Y.T. Li is an inventor, an educator, an interpreter, the entrepreneur. He was from a very well-to-do family, and he's describing his family has tennis court, and they had tutors for their English, even music. So he's a very talented person, and was, as I said, he was entered the special mechanical engineering graduate school and went to MIT, and then built the first factory. So he's known as a gifted and generous man who enjoyed tennis, skiing, and singing. And he taught at MIT, and his specialty is automatic controlling system, and he's a co-founder of the famous Main Vehicle Laboratory and the Innovation Center at MIT. He also founded several companies together with his brother, S.Y. Li. Both of them were members of the National Academy of Engineering, and he fostered scientific interactions between US and China. Now, Chen Shih-I, known as H.S. Chen in this country, is a brilliant rocket scientist. He's considered to be the father of China's missile and space program. And he has a very interesting story. So he was from the Chen family in Hangzhou. So this is a very famous family that traced back to 2,000 years ago. Many outstanding people came out of that family. So he was on the Box Scholarship, as I mentioned before, came to MIT to study in 1975, and again he got his PhD under von Karman. And working very closely with von Karman, and von Karman considered his a genius in here. So he was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and they're in top advisors of the US Air Force. So the members of American Air Force Scientific Board and had the rank of colonel, Dr. Chen. He was a music lover, and he married a famous opera singer, Jiang Ying, who was trained in Europe. And he taught at MIT, became full professor. 1947, he moved back to Jet Professional Laboratory and became the director, and he filed for US citizenship. He was on top of the world, and he was very bright, sometimes very sharp, sometimes arrogant, but he's on top of the world at the time. Unfortunately, he was accused of being a communist or a communist sympathizer during the Red Scare, during the McCarthy period. So 1950 is all the time is the time when the Korean War broke. And he was stripped of his security clearance, and the Caltech colleagues defended him and got him out of jail. He was detained for 5 years. He was not allowed to do the work in his area of his deep research, but he can do something, teach some courses, but he was retained. He was humiliated and was furious. In 1955, through basically the prisoner exchange type of deal, China released the captured American pilot, and the US government let him go to China. So he was so angry by the treatment, he was determined to dedicate his life to help the building of the Chinese defense and the rocket program. So the former Navy Secretary Dan Campbell said, it was a stupid thing this country ever did. He was no more a communist than I was, and we forced him to go. So because his contribution for the missile program in China, he was considered to be a national hero. But there are also some think that his scientific prestige might have been misused to support Mao's ultralight policy. For example, in the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, and that led to disaster. He was humiliated by the Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution, and afterwards, I believe he humiliated himself by trying to follow the correct party line in this power struggle in China. So I've been thinking about what is the situation here. Basically, when the two countries are in the opposite side in conflict, people suffered, and this brilliant scientist was suffered from this type of thing. So I believe as Chinese Americans or US trained Chinese scientists, many of them are here under training, we should do our best to reduce the possible misunderstanding and the confrontation between US and China. Now, let me tell you a happy story about a family of Chinese Americans scientists. Xue Jiqian was the cousin of Qian Xuesen and 4 years junior. He's always ranked #1 in class. Came from the Qian family. And he went to MIT under the Boxer Scholarship at the same year as his cousin. And he studied aeronautic engineering. As soon as he gets his master's, there's government assignment. Ask him to buy factories in Buffalo and send it back to China. So, and after that, he went back to build the first aircraft engine factory together with Y.T. Lee in China, and married E.N. Lee, that's Y.T.'s sister, so they're brother-in-laws. And then in India, he organized and imported wartime supplies to Western China, and it's a very important work. Who is helping China in sending ships to the United States, sending wartime supplies to China to fight the Japanese? Of course, it's the United States. So this is probably the best time of U.S.-China friendship, because they're fighting the same enemies and helping each other in here. And again, for obvious reasons, in 1948, he returned to the U.S. and worked for Exxon and other companies and made many contributions. So in China, he really contributed significantly, dedicated to China. After he moved to the United States, he made major contributions in the United States. So Sue and I were lucky to be neighbors in Livingston, New Jersey. They're neighbors, so I know them in person. And there's a family picture of the Chen family. They have 3 sons. Richard and Roger both were elected to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. And Richard is a renowned neurobiologist, and Roger won the Nobel Prize in 2008 for the development of green fluorescence protein, which is a very powerful tool in biology. So apparently, the genes of the Chens and the Lees has brought to the United States. So are their cultural heritage. Perhaps I can say this to many of the other Chinese American scientists. Now, Zhengning Yang and Zheng Dao Li is the first Nobel Prize winners. At that when they won the first prize, of course, the work was done in the United States. At that time, they were the citizens of Republic of China. And this is very important because this really to show the Chinese people that Chinese are not inferior in science. We can do it under the proper environment. So C.N. Yang was his father, is a professor mathematician. He was really grown in the Tsinghua campus and sent to the to U.S. to study University of Chicago, and he won the Nobel Prize together with Zheng Dao Li.
His father was also trained in Chicago.
Is that correct? I didn't know that part. Yeah. So you can see the training of generation of scientists. T.D. Lee is a very bright student. He was sent to the United States to study in his sophomore years because he's just so bright. It's no sense of wasting 2 more years to study in China. So he studied under Fermi and taught at different universities. And he was at age 30, he was a full professor at Columbia University. And he was for the Li and Yang prediction, which was proven by the Wu experiment, overturns the parity theory in nuclear physics. Both of them can affect the U.S.-China relationship. They really help to bring the relationship, to normalize the relationship, and they help to rehabilitate China in science, even though their personal approach are different. Now, Wu Jianxiong, Professor Wu, was educated in China and UC Berkeley, and he worked at joined the Manhattan Project, and then then taught at Columbia. As you can see, her promotion has been slow as compared to T.D. Lee and many others. And in 1956, he conducted the famous Wu experiment, which is experimental proof of the Li and Yang prediction. So this makes Li and Yang win the Nobel Prize. Some people think he should be co-awardees to share the Nobel Prize. But, well, Columbia promoted her to full professor the next year. So here's the list of Nobel Prize laureate with Chinese origin. We talk about Li and Yang. Samuel Ding won his Nobel Prize by discovery of the J particle. And Yuan Li went in chemistry. Yuan then went back to China. He was educated in China and the United States, and then back to China, back to Taiwan to become the president of Academic Seneca. And Daniel Cui won the prize in physics. The next group of people, Stephen Chu and Roger Chen, they're Chinese Americans when they're training. So they are trained American scientists. So that's why I put them in a different category. The Charles Gall was trained in Britain. And the next 4 are pure Chinese, has nothing to do with US training. I congratulate Tu Youyou, won the recent Nobel Prize in physics, in physiology and medicine. Now I'm skipping this one. So I'm talking about the third part of the group of people. Basically, after the normalization between US and China, there's a tremendous interaction between US and China. I'm trying to show you some data, but the data is too big for me to handle. I just say it's tremendous. That in the environment. So I just want to give you 2 events that I witnessed to show some of the potential. So one is in cancer research. In the 70s, the Chinese scientists identified high-risk areas, and they're localized. It's unusual. We don't see this in the United States, but it's in China, for example, liver cancer in certain areas, stomach cancer in certain areas. So that's the time when the US scientists see the opportunity for collaboration. So you cannot see it very clear on the slide, but there, for example, to study H. pylori infection and stomach cancer, identified aflatoxin exposure and HBV infection as the major cause of liver cancer. I was on the Linxian study to study nutrition and esophageal cancer. So this type of story was published in a recent paper in Cancer Prevention Research, which I co-authored with several Chinese scientists. We also talk about the how should we do, what should we do to prevent the modern cancers, namely lung cancer, memory cancer, and colon cancer. Now, the second event I want to talk to you about is an organization called Society of Chinese Bioscientists in America. So this was founded in 1985 by a group of scientists. They are in their 40s, probably in their 40s. That Dr. Ray Wars here was one of the founders. I was one of them. So basically, the purpose is to promote research, help with the communication, and in the long run to interaction between China and the United States. Of course, most of the scientists are from Taiwan and Hong Kong. Of course, we do not have an ambition trying to change China, but the ambition to do it well professionally and for scientific exchange with scientists in China. It does serve the purpose. I was in Taipei in June to attend the 15th International Symposium. And this is a very high caliber meeting with some outstanding scientists as speaker, with attendance of 1,000 people from Taiwan, mainland China, and the United States. And this was hosted at Academic Seneca. It's a very perfect meeting place. And I want to just mention a few scientists to show the potential of the US-China interaction, the potential to benefit human society. Wang Jihui is the president of the Academic Seneca. He was trained in Taiwan and then at Harvard, in the MIT and Harvard, and he taught at the Scripps Clinic, was a member of Scripps Clinic, and Texas A&M, and in Japan. So he's a renowned scientist to study chemistry and biology of glycosylation, or glycobiology. So he led a very large program in developing vaccines against influenza and cancer, a very unique approach. And if it's successful, will benefit a large number of people. And this is Wei Yang, was trained in China, in Stony Brook and Columbia, and Yale. So he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, attacking a very difficult problem in immunology. Sunny Xie is known to the pioneer work in single molecule enzymology and single cell genomics. So he'd be able to study this in the single molecule level and single cell level. And he was educated in Beijing University and then UCSD. And he has received, for his work, he has received many awards elected to the National Academy of Sciences. He was endowed chair, or he was appointed endowed chair, he's still endowed chair at Harvard. And he's the visiting professor and also a part-time director of the Biodynamic Optic Imaging Center in Beijing University. Look, he has the best students at Harvard and at Beijing University from both countries to work with. So the potential for making breakthroughs and pushing the frontier of science is great. This has really very big potential in here. Now, Yang Nian is a structural biologist. He was trained in Beijing, in Tsinghua, came to Princeton, and returned to Tsinghua, become a professor. And after he went back, he has many publications in top journals, very nice work. And he gave a very beautiful presentation at the meeting on structure and mechanistic investigation of human glucose transporters, GLUT4 protein. I see futures in Chinese science with this type of young scientist. At a very young age, it's very accomplished. We want to see more and more of this. See, as long as the US and China relationship keep in good relationship, and this will bloom, the blossom, and really benefit to society and humanity. Now, when we talk about this, I get to the point but there's also people feel competition between China and the United States. So this is something that we need to think about it. If we're not careful, misguided policies or the military industrial complex will drive for the collision of these two countries. So in conclusion, I would like to share with you that the US trained Chinese scientists have contributed greatly to science development in both the United States and China, and social reform in China. Their contribution has benefited both countries, especially when the two countries are not in conflict. So I'm always wondering, what if Mao Zedong was in the group of students who came to the United States? Would history be different? Now, in the first group of students, they went back to China. The second group of students, they went back to China and came back to the United States. The third group of students mostly stay in China. So now the scientists generally choose a favorable environment to develop their career and to make most contributions to society. So they have the freedom to choose. But the scientists who have received the best education in China and the United States, those are taxpayers' money. I believe they have the obligation to think about the benefit of the two societies, because they're in excellent position to help minimize possible misunderstanding and confrontation between the two countries and to promote world peace. As a US-trained Chinese scientist and American citizen, I believe strongly we have the obligation to promote interactions and to improve their relationships and benefit humanity. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Young, for that very stimulating lecture, which not only put things in a broad historical perspective, but also gives a lot of food for thought for the future for both of our countries. So we have a few minutes left. If there are any questions from the audience, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Well,
yes.
I'm concerned about an aspect of science in China and current China. And I've had a lot of interaction with Chinese, with Xi and Yang in particular, and then Yang, Frank Yang as he was called here. And the issue is related to the underlying philosophy, and that's even a problem in the United States.
it's hard for me to say, but I think I made a comment, traditionally the Chinese has been science as Unitarian because they want to find something useful. Even do the basic research in physics, they have Nobel Prize in mind. But Tu Youyou got the Nobel Prize by doing something very traditional, sort of useful. So I think that gives them, for the Chinese leader to really think. But the general society is really getting to do something. The curiosity-driven science is not there. Even in the top university laboratories, that probably is thinking about productivity is more important than curiosity. But that probably take a long time to change, or if ever.
Other questions?
May I ask a question? Is it my turn, Chris?
Pardon me?
May I ask, or do you want to ask someone else?
No, please go ahead, and then we'll ask.
Professor Yang, I had a quick, delicate question to ask. I have a friend called Shaoxing Si, who was very much in the news recently, where there were charges filed against him, and there seems to be some difficulties with Chinese scientists that people have identified in the United States. Do you have any comments about that?
I think it's very unfortunate. See, when the two countries get into this type of competition and there's suspicion of espionage, and this, too bad, he was sort of charged, and then now the case has been dropped. So it's basically it's an understanding issue, and personally, I would think about, especially this property right, intellectual property issues. I think that the most important issue basically is to follow the rule. If, for example, if we design some document, as other universities do, we should do it. According to the rule, to avoid possible problems. That's my own comment. Yeah, they are. I'm not familiar. I think that's important for Americans to know, to understand China better. I think the government policy, their propaganda is one thing. How people think is another thing. Yes?
Actually, before I ask the question, I want to add to what you said. As a student who has studied in China, I studied there for a total of just under 2 years. A year, a semester, a couple of summer classes. What I feel like the problem is in both countries is that ideological motivations get in the way of people of taking advantage of education to broaden people's own analytical skills. And my question to you is, how do you think that people who have experience across both countries can help minimize ideological interference with scientific progress?
I think that would take time because in China, the government is so strong that I think still gradually, more and more people, they still can influence the society. Or many of the professors scientists from the United States visiting China, doing collaborations or doing short-term teachings. Sometimes they feel that, sometimes they can set an example. You can do a science this way. It doesn't have to do it the other way, which they don't think is the proper way. So I think it takes gradual change, and then probably it takes time. It's hard to predict how fast it's going to be, and because of the political situation. But all the students, they accept, they understand, they agree with what we think here about freedom of speech, of learning, of inquiry. But the government seems to be holding back on that.